Are you seeing the screen? Do you see the screen? Hello? Am I back? Can you see me now? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, I'm sharing the screen again. Sorry, there is some disruption here with the internet, but I hope it doesn't persist. And you can see the screen? Great, great. Fine, so we are continuing our historical overview of this course, and today we will dedicate our class to the final stage of the development of Byzantine iconography in the proper Byzantine imperial time. So starting with the end of iconoclasm, and the last time we discussed iconoclasm. So starting with the end of iconoclasm and all the way till the end of the Byzantine Empire and even beyond, because the iconography developed beyond the historical limits of the Byzantine Empire in the lands that were then occupied by the Turks, like Asia Minor and Greece, but also beyond Byzantine borders in Serbia, in the Balkan countries, in Bulgaria, in Italy, in Rus, and so on. So today we will be reviewing this development, and I have a problem in this course with time because the course is kind of short and so compact. So I'm trying to really squeeze as much information as possible into this, well, reasonably as much information as possible in this short course. So I will try to balance, especially in my today's presentation, historical overview with a little bit of theological excursuses. So I will try to stop from time to time in this historical survey and try to make some emphasis on theological content of the images. So we start seeing actually some theological developments and some important elements of theological and spiritual symbolism in those images. And our last class on Saturday, and perhaps one more next week, will be dedicated purely to theology, theological, symbolical analysis of some icons. We will be looking at the most common types of the representation of Jesus Christ, of Mary, and main events of salvation history, which are the main feasts of liturgical calendar of the Church: Resurrection of Christ, Nativity, Christmas, Epiphany, Transfiguration, and perhaps some other events. So, but we will need to combine those historical analysis with theological one, as I will attempt to do in this present lecture. So if we're speaking about the development of Byzantine iconography in this period, after iconoclasm till middle 15th century, we can divide it into several consecutive steps. And those steps are tied to ruling dynasties of Byzantine emperors that reigned in these periods. Accordingly, there are Macedonian, dynasty and Macedonian period in the development of Byzantine art, Comnene dynasty, so mid-11th and almost the end of the 12th century. And then the flow of Byzantine history is interrupted by the destruction of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in the year 1204, and subsequent existence of the so-called Latin Kingdom of Constantinople between 1204 and 1261. Then Byzantine state was renewed with the regaining of the city of Constantinople in 1261, and it gave the start to the so-called Paleologian dynasty, the final dynasty of the Byzantine Empire that lasted till its end in 1453. And those three stages, Macedonian, Comnene, and Paleologian, have quite precise features in art that differentiate them from each other and from the rest of the history of Byzantine art. So we will be paying attention to those features, and we will be trying to see the gradual development of Byzantine iconography through these three stages. Although somehow interrupted by the Fourth Crusade, but still even that period of interruption was in a way fruitful for art, in terms that on the one hand, Western influences penetrated into Byzantine art. On the other hand, much more powerfully, Byzantine artistic influences fertilized the West. A lot was taken from Byzantium physically and intellectually and dispersed through Western European countries by the Crusaders that influenced later developments in the Western art. We will not be analyzing the Western art because it's not the subject of our course, but this kind of forced exchange between Byzantium and the West during the time during the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade is important, and we just have to mention it. This period is also known for a missionary expansion of Christianity due to the efforts of Byzantine missionaries, ecclesiastical and political, and the rise of local, and one can say ethnic or national iconographic schools in the whole post-Byzantine world, in the Balkans, in modern-day Bulgaria, in the modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and also in Western territories such as the island of Crete and other Aegean, Mediterranean islands and Italy. And we will try to review this vast geographical area and see how different schools of iconography emerge there with distinct local flavor. So starting with this Macedonian period, sometimes it's referred to as Macedonian Renaissance. So Macedonian period of revival, and the revival was logical because it's the end of the iconoclast period, so the arts start to regain their position in the church and in the society. But maybe even more importantly, this is a period of economic growth in the empire, political stability, and intensive patronage of arts on the part of imperial family and provincial, central imperial and provincial nobility. So there is a huge influx of money into the arts and into the foundation of different monasteries, different religious centers, and that, of course, always is favorable for the development of architecture and visual art. And we will see this on the example of three main places, three main centers of Christian art in that period, namely Constantinople itself as the capital, the monastery of Osios Lucas in near Athens in Greece, and Niamuni is another monastery on an island close to present-day Turkey. And those Osios Lucas and Niamuni were built in 11th century and decorated with elaborate mosaics in the same period. And these are important monuments, important testimonies of the art of that period. But we will start with the capital, Constantinople. The first creation of art that has to be considered here is this famous mosaic of Mary holding Jesus in this very magnificent imperial position, sitting on the throne. This mosaic is decorating the apse dome over the semi-dome over the apse in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, so this main church of Byzantine Christendom. And the mosaic was constructed allegedly to commemorate the Sunday of Orthodoxy, the final triumph of the church over iconoclastic heresy, and is believed to be inaugurated solemnly in the year 867. And the celebration was marked, celebration of the dedication of this mosaic was marked by a great homily by Patriarch Photius, who was a very well-known ecclesiastical figure and a leading intellectual of his time. And he delivered a number of important homilies that came down to us, but one of those homilies is actually celebrating the dedication of this mosaic and kind of literally describes the mosaica. So this is a prominent example of Byzantine imperial art, because Mary is represented here in the already familiar position. We have seen the images like this in the previous lectures. Starting with this ancient Sinai icon from the 6th century, where Mary was seated in the center, flanked by 2 martyrs and 2 angels on the back of the throne. And she is represented here as the Mother Queen holding Jesus. And you can see that Jesus is not exactly a baby; it's almost a grown-up boy, dressed in gold, because he is the real emperor and she is the regent for the emperor. And they are both mounted, seated on this elaborate throne with a footstool. So the mosaica is kind of visually representing the idea of the Lord who reigns over the whole world, and the Lord who reigns over the church. And the vivid visual representation of Jesus and Mary is symbolic for the triumph of the church over iconoclasm. The other peculiarity of this period is that many mosaics are dedicated or are basically showing the patronage, the already mentioned patronage of imperial family and nobility over the arts. So many mosaics are literally dedicated to showing how the emperor and an empress, or emperor and his family, are offering something to Jesus or to Jesus and Mary. And we will be seeing a number of those mosaics on the following slides, and they all follow one and the same pattern. It's Jesus on the throne as the true king, true emperor, and the human emperor is falling down before him, bowing down to his feet, or at least in other mosaics standing on the right and the left side of Jesus' throne, bowing down the head and presenting some gifts. So in the civilization so despotic as the Byzantium was, with the emperor being in almost semi-divine position, it's a very brave presentation, because here the emphasis is very clear. This is Jesus Christ, who is the true King of heaven and earth, and the emperor is simply a human partner to him, so to speak, who might rule the earth, but he still has to bow down before the true Lord. Again, this iconography is very imperial. Jesus is represented on the throne as the king, with the blessing gesture, with the open book of the gospel, quoting some text from that or other gospel passage. And in this case, Jesus is surrounded by a symbolic representation of the Annunciation. So Mary on the one side and Gabriel on the other. And Mary is stretching her hands in prayer to Jesus. We will be seeing this composition of the so-called intercession or deesis. In Greek, deesis means prayer, intercession. And this composition will be re-emerging in Byzantine art pretty often. Also mark the figure of Jesus. He is presented always straightforward in this so-called hieratic, sacred position. He is like authoritative teacher, dignified king, ruler. His head is surrounded by the cross halo, and it's only Jesus in Byzantine iconography that has this cross halo. No other person can have it, just ordinary halos without the sign of the cross. And Jesus is blessing and holding the book. We will see these elements in the iconography of Christ when we speak about it in more detail in a due course. Just a few more examples of this. This is the earliest example of this, coming from mid-9th century. And then in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and in other places, these votive mosaics representing emperors or emperor and the empress are very common. They are repeated basically every 50 years or so. There is a number of them in Hagia Sophia. This one from the late 9th century represents, again, Mary with Jesus on the throne, with elaborate medallions with the inscriptions Mother of God in Greek letters, Meter Peu. And there are two emperors on two sides, which did not live simultaneously and did not live in the time when the mosaic was created, but those are the founder of the city, Constantine the Great, who brings as his gift to Christ the city he founded, Constantinople, and Justinian, who is holding a small replica of the church in which this mosaic is placed, of the Hagia Sophia. So these two key figures in Byzantine history, two most important and most prominent emperors, Constantine, who created the Eastern Roman Empire and built the city of Constantinople and transferred the capital from old Rome to the new Rome, and Justinian, who founded Hagia Sophia and was the most successful politically and military emperor after Constantine. Now, another similar mosaic from Hagia Sophia from mid-11th century, representing Jesus. And see, his iconography is quite similar to what we have seen on the previous one. On the on this one, it's very different artistically, but if you pay attention to key elements, they remain the same. So we have large inscriptions saying Jesus Christ, Jesus Christos. We have the cross halo. We have the frontal position, the magnificent frontal position, the blessing, and the book. In the previous one, the book was open. In this case, it's closed and sealed. So the ancient books, they were kind of fat. They were not keeping well together because they were written on parchment, on the skin of animals, and they were thick. So to keep them together, technically, you needed like special, how to say, the kind of ribbons or metal elements that would keep the book together. And those also have symbolic meaning. We will discuss that a little later. But in this case, again, these are two, this is the emperor and his wife, and he is representing money he donated to the church for the renovation and for making this mosaic. And his wife, Zoe, holding a scroll, which probably represents like it's like a foundation document for the renovation or restoration of the church. Another similar mosaic from 12th century now, again representing an emperor and his wife Irene, Mary with Jesus, but in this case not on the throne, but in an upright standing position. Just to add to this, I couldn't miss it because I think it's the most astonishing mosaic I have ever seen, and I was lucky to see it in the original upon my visit to Istanbul and visiting Hagia Sophia a number of years ago. But this is a big one. It's situated on the lofts of the church, a kind of second floor. And it's, I would say it's like 3 meters tall, certainly like double human size. And as you can see, it's heavily damaged on the lower part, but it's luckily well preserved where our faces, and Jesus' face is extremely impressive. It's really conveys the presence. It's something absolutely extraordinary from the artistic and I would say from spiritual point of view. This is a mosaic that is worth seeing once you are out of the pandemic and you can travel, and if you are in Europe, take your chance to visit Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Unfortunately, it's now turned into the mosque again, but it's open for tourists, and hopefully you will be able to see not only the main space of the church, but also to visit the galleries and see those mosaics I have just shown you, and especially this one. This is obviously not representing emperor and the empress. It's this famous intercession composition, the deities, representing Jesus in the center. Again, as you can see, the blessing and the closed book. And then Mary and John the Baptist standing on two sides of Jesus, stretching their hands in prayer. Well, it's lost with Mary, but you can kind of guess it with John. And it's a common Byzantine representation we will be seeing a number of times today in the following lectures. So the deist represents the idea that Jesus is the universal king who saved the world, but also he will be coming to judge the world again. So he is judging it now, and he will manifestly come to judge it in his second coming, and the saints intercede for the world to be judged mildly with mercy. And Mary and John are key figures in this intercession. John as the representative of the old, so he's the greatest, by quoting the words of Jesus himself, he's the greatest of the Old Testament prophets, and Mary as the mother of God. So we are seeing like two testaments coming together to intercede for the humanity. Moving further, there are two more important centers for the Christian art in this period. As I said before, Osios Lukas in the mainland Greece near Athens, and Neamuni on island Chios in the Aegean Sea. These are monasteries built in this period, subsidized, generously founded by the emperor and the various representatives of noble families. So a lot of money were given to the construction of the monasteries and to the foundation and support of the communities. And the monks were seen in this time as very important members of the Byzantine Church and Byzantine society, those who kind of secured well-being of the state, of the emperor, and of the society with their prayers, and also secured the posthumous well-being of people for whom they prayed. So they were seen as, in modern terms, an important investment. They were supposed to pray for the living and for the dead all the time, and no money was spared to support that mission. Osios Lukas has rich mosaic and partially fresco decorations inside. You can see this kind of proto-iconostasis, this very, in this case, very modest, very minimal screen separating the sanctuary space from the rest of the church, with two icons of Jesus and Mary holding the child. And then there is a big Pantocrator mosaica, the Almighty Lord fresco in the dome, and a rich mosaic elaboration here in the sanctuary. And if we see this closer, it's again Mary enthroned. This is this favorite Byzantine representation of Mary with the Lord in the direct upright position on the throne. And here you would have to guess, but this is the Pentecost event, the descent of the Holy Spirit. So the apostles are seated on the perimeter of the round dome, and there is the image of God represented, the Trinity, symbolic representation of the Trinity in the center, and there are kind of rays of light coming from God on the heads of the apostles, and in the midst of each ray, there is a tongue of fire, a red dot you might see on your screens, representing this descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles. This will be a common representation in Byzantine iconography, and we will come back to it when we speak about the iconography of feasts. Osios Lukas, the name Osios means venerable. So this is a title for the monastic saints, and the monastery is dedicated to one of those saints, Lucas. And the mosaics of this church follow, they are good examples of this Byzantine synthesis of Hellenic art, traditional Greco-Roman art, with Byzantine, specifically Christian flavor. And there are many, we don't have time, and I'm honestly speaking not a great specialist on the art of antiquity, but there is a lot written on the subject, how these mosaics in Macedonian period in general, and in Osios Lucas in particular, represent this kind of combination of the revival of Hellenic art on the one hand, and essentially Christian art on the other hand. So they kind of come together. For me as a Ukrainian, it's also important that this art represented in Osios Lucas is believed to be the inspiration for the mosaics of the Church of Holy Sophia in Kiev, in Ukraine, since these were Byzantine missionaries who brought Christianity to Ukraine, and these were Byzantine artists and architects and iconographers who made first churches in Ukraine. It's very probable hypothesis that this strand of art that is attested in Osios Lucas was also carried on in Kiev in Hagia Sophia, and we will be seeing the mosaics of Hagia Sophia a little bit later today. Here again we have this common representation of Christ the Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty, with the cross nimbus, with the blessing hand, and with the open book with a rather lengthy gospel text saying, "I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will not wander in the darkness, but will find the life," something like that. So it's a quote from the Gospel of John. Another mosaic from the same Osios Lucas church. You can see this menander here, the common Greek, ancient Greek pattern, and the washing of the feet of the disciples in the middle, represented as the main motive. The washing of the feet of the disciples was an important symbolic event because it's not only an opening scene of the Last Supper, but it's also a symbolic representation of baptism, and it's written here on iptir. So the washing, or the washing, but with the resonances of Christian ritual of washing away sin through the water of baptism. Now let's turn to the Nea Muni monastery and look at its mosaics. They are roughly from the same period, but very different in style, as you can see. They are much more elaborate in details. So those ones were very monumental. You can see it with Jesus. You can see it here, kind of simpler. Here they are more, it's more minute work with all the details. And in this case, we are seeing the anastasis, the resurrection of Christ, or the descent to Hades, to hell, with Jesus holding his cross as the triumphal banner, and fetching Adam by his rest, I guess, right? This part of the hand. And Eve and other Old Testament righteous are rising from their tombs. On this part, we have also Old Testament righteous people and the two kings are probably represented David and Solomon, but they are represented as Byzantine emperors with the crowns typical to Byzantine emperors and in the dress precisely as Byzantine emperors wore in the time when this mosaic was made. So this is probably to celebrate their generous donations to the construction and decoration of this church. And also pay attention to this Hellenistic nature of this art, because, for example, all the Old Testament righteous are raising from the tombs, but those tombs, see, they are represented as the sarcophagi we have seen in one of our previous presentations, with these Christian symbols of the cross with X letter, and also on this side. So it's a detail that has nothing to do, of course, with the reality of the Old Testament holy men. They were not buried in the Roman or Greco-Roman sarcophagi, but it has to do with the Greco-Roman roots of Byzantine culture with which they were so proud. Another mosaic from the same church in near Moni represented Epiphany, or the baptism of Jesus in Jordan. So Jesus is fully immersed in water. You can see the kind of lines of water going all the way to his neck. He's completely naked, something that will not be so common for later iconography, but here it's a kind of natural continuation of antique tendencies in art. The naked body is not something to be ashamed of, and the whole theological idea of Jesus being baptized by John is closely connected with humility. Jesus is represented here as a slave, as someone who comes to perform the will of God, and as this slave of God, servant of God, he is naturally naked, because slaves were naked in ancient times. And yeah, there are many interesting details, but we don't have time to go into that. Just we'll pay attention this personification of Jordan as a human person, something again taken over from the ancient Greco-Roman art, where certain powers of nature or certain phenomena of nature could have been personified with human figures. And in this case, there are two personifications of male and a female, one representing Jordan, another representing a sea. In Greek, the river is male, is a masculine noun, and the sea is a feminine noun. So a male person would represent the river Jordan, and a feminine person here represents the sea. And you would ask why river and the sea, because one of the favorite quotes from the Bible, from the book of Psalms, for the celebration of the Jordan event of Jesus' baptism would be, what happened to you, O Jordan, that you have turned back, and to you, the Red Sea, that you have fled away. So some in my improvised translation. So there is it's a quotation from Psalter, from the Psalms, celebrating the power of God over the waters. So God has pushed away the Red Sea for the Israel to cross the sea, and he also stopped the stream of the Jordan when the Israelites marched into the Holy Land with Joshua. And then when Jesus comes to Jordan, this quotation from the Psalm becomes for the church as a kind of prophetic symbolical text from the Old Testament that is used again and again in baptismal liturgy and in the liturgy of the Day of Epiphany. Just to appreciate the peculiar style of these mosaics from Nea Muni, here are some fragments representing these kings, the emperors, and Mary under the cross with women and so on. Now let's turn to a slightly, radically different kind of art, but from the same period. The Macedonian Renaissance knew different sorts of art that were commissioned by rich people, and one peculiar kind of art that comes from this period are the ivory carving reliefs, like this one, a triptych preserved now in Louvre in the French Museum in Paris. It comes from Byzantium from mid-10th century and represents the already familiar scene of Jesus on the throne, flanked by Mary and John the Baptist, who are interceding to him. So the Deis composition. And then many saints surrounding this main representation. Below that, we have apostles, Peter, Paul, Andrew, and John the theologian, and James. So Peter, Paul, Andrew, John, James. And various martyrs. The warrior martyrs on the upper part of that, and some other martyrs here. Martyrs were very popular saints in Byzantium. They are mostly coming from early Christian centuries, from the persecutions, and those warrior martyrs were usually Roman soldiers or Roman generals who were not ashamed or not afraid to profess their Christianity and were at some point killed for that. And these other martyrs represent popular martyrs venerated by Byzantine Christians like Demetrius, Procopius, Theodore, George. So that's the same George that we see fighting dragon on some icons, and so on. So the choice of martyrs is hard to display, hard to explain. They might be connected to some names, male names, or in the family that commissioned this triptych, or might be just an expression of personal piety of the patron for whom this triptych was made. Another example of the same type of ivory carving, but it's a triptych. So they were all used in private devotion. You see that they are made like a window. There is a main part, and there are these two smaller parts could be folded and cover the main part. So it was probably made for transportation for people who were traveling and wanted to take them with them. They are small. They are really like palm size or about that. So they are clearly made for portable use. And in this case, they are representing the scenes of various feasts or events from the gospel, with the obvious one, the crucifixion, in the center. And then Jesus brought before Pilate or before Herod, so the part of the passion narrative. And in this case, it's Mary meeting with Elizabeth. So you see the two women figures kissing, Mary and Elizabeth. The Annunciation, Mary and angel with the wings lifted up, kind of curious detail I've never seen anywhere else. And then shepherds announced by the angel to go to Bethlehem. And here it's probably this, if I'm not mistaken, it's the slaying of the children in Bethlehem by soldiers. And the nativity scene in the center. So Mary lying on her bed and Jesus in the crib here. And bull and ox, the two animals that are typical for the presentation of Christmas. And then Mary sitting on the throne in an elaborate headdress with the three kings coming with the gifts. So again, a very, very typical Christmas type representation. Just one more example of this art, the famous 40 Martyrs of Sebastia. These were, again, Roman soldiers in the 3rd century or beginning of the 4th century that were martyred by being placed in a freezing water in a lake in the mountains in Asia Minor, in Sebastia, and they died from cold there in water, and they were very widely popular and venerated martyrs in Byzantium. To their memory, many icons, many mosaics, many frescoes are dedicated, and many homilies in Byzantine literature. So this relief represents their martyrdom standing in the freezing lake. Another important group of artifacts from this period are illuminated books or illustrated books. And the most famous of those is the so-called Paris Psalter. It's Paris only because it's preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France today, but it's obviously coming from Constantinople. It was probably stolen during the Fourth Crusade and ended up in private hands in France, and then was placed in the National Library there. This is a heavily illustrated Psalter that has the most strongly felt association with the art of antiquity. It looks very, very Greek, very Hellenic, although the content of all images is obviously Christian. It illustrates the story of David in the Bible, but the style is like 100% Hellenistic. If you did not know that it's a Psalter, you could easily take this for just any, like Iliad or Odyssey or any other book from classical Greece. So this is a very common presentation of David playing the harp, but he's surrounded by personifications. This woman is inscribed here as Prophetia, the prophecy. So she is kind of whispering him in the ear what to play and what to sing on his Lear or whatever it is. Here we have the fight of David with Goliath. So here is this giant Goliath is throwing his spear at David, and David is hitting him with the stone, and David is aided by the angel. Angel is literally holding his body and directing his hand here, and now David is cutting off the head of his defeated enemy. So just the illustration of the biblical stories. Just a couple more examples from the same book. The miniatures, the illuminations are made in a different styles. So the previous ones were clearly by one hand. This one, at least, is different from this, but very different from this. So sometimes scholars think that the so-called Paris Psalter is a collection of various just pages from ancient psalters, Byzantine psalters, or might be one book, but just illustrated by different artists. In any case, again, here we have the story of Moses climbing the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. And here again, Prophet Isaiah in the center, and this lady here is Nyx, so night in Greek, and she's covered with this scarf having stars on it. With this, it has the color of night and decorated with the stars. And the boy here is, there is an inscription, Orthros, which means morning. So it's the kind of symbolic illustration of a saying from the book of Isaiah that I was expecting, I was eagerly looking towards morning, from night towards morning to pray to you. So the prayerful spirit of the prophet is compared with the hope of a person who is impatiently awaiting a morning. And a Byzantine artist here goes into the best of his ability to use this personification by representing prophet as a human figure in the center, surrounded by these two symbolical figures, figure of the night and figure of the morning or the dawn. And the stretched hand of the Lord sends him inspiration or enlightenment from heaven. Just one more example of this illumination, the famous Joshua scroll. That is the biblical book of Joshua, written in a number of lines here, but with these magnificent illustrations in a very different style, but still impressive representations of different scenes from the book of Joshua. Okay, so much for the Macedonian Renaissance. We will just much more briefly recount some important aspects from the Comnene period and then Paleologian period, and that will be the basically end of our today's presentation. So the Comnene period is characterized by many icons, obviously, but a number of centers that there is a number of centers that deserve to be mentioned here, and one of the most important is San Marco Cathedral in Venice. It's one of the most magnificent pieces of Byzantine architecture, is extremely elaborately decorated and very well preserved, because it was not only avoided all the misfortunes of Ottoman occupation, because it's located in northern Italy, and so there were no Turks there and nothing was destroyed, but also it was well supported by the Venetian state, and the mosaics were well taken care of, because Venice is one of the world centers for production of smalta for mosaics, and they were very careful about restoring the mosaics all the time. So some of the mosaics are as early as 12th century, but some have been repaired and redone all the way till 19th century. So it's a church that represents different strata of the Mosaic art, but in its main appearance, it comes back to the 12th century, and it's the home to the extremely elaborate cycles of mosaics, representing both traditional Byzantine program of decoration of the church and some unique representations. For example, the 7 days of creation. So it's like the great on one of the domes in this church, the whole Genesis creation story is represented in mosaics. There are figures of various saints, personifications of various virtues, and so on. It's a very, very, very important piece of Byzantine art. Just few examples, the mosaic of the Crucifixion. You can see it's very detailed, even in comparison with the ones we have seen in Osios Lucas or Neamoni or others. It has many figures. These figures are very expressive. Their proportions are very prolonged, and the iconography is like full blown. It has in many icons of crucifixion or even mosaics, we can see like one angel on this side and one on this. And here it's a number of angels deploring the death of Jesus, and Mary and John, the evangelist, and the apostles and holy women, and so on. So it's a very like the maximal representation of crucifixion. And here is something similar about the resurrection. So again, the familiar representation, Jesus with the cross, symbolizing his victory over death, taking Adam by hand, Eve and the Old Testament righteous man. And here again, you can see the two kings wearing crowns of Byzantine emperors, and John the Baptist standing here as the forerunner of Jesus in the earthly life and his forerunner in Hades. So John is believed to be like proclaiming Jesus' resurrection among the dead. And then we have this terrible figure of the Hades, of the personified representation of hell that is trampled down and bound by feet and by hands with metal chains. Another familiar representation, which we just saw in Osios Lucas, the symbolic representation of the Trinity here in the center. The Trinity is symbolically represented as a divine throne with the gospel book on the throne and the symbol of the dove. So the throne, the empty throne, is kind of symbolically representing the Father, the gospel book, the Son, and the image of the dove, the Holy Spirit. But it's not the icon of the Holy Trinity as such. It's a kind of vague symbolic representation. And then from this main heart of the icon, which is the Holy Trinity, the rays of light are coming down on the apostles, culminating at the red tongues of fire resting on the heads of each of the apostles. And then groups of people are represented here that are the mentioned, various nations or various tribes that are mentioned in the book of Acts of the Apostles. So when apostles started to speak various languages, these people gathered from various countries were standing there and saying, oh, we understand what they are saying, although we come from there and from there and from there and from there. So that's the inscriptions here, the Cappadocians, the Pontians, so the enumeration of various nations or various groups of people coming from various places who are receiving the preaching of the apostles. As you can see, I just mentioned that these mosaics were maintained and redone all the time till the 19th century, and you can see that because the ancient mosaics were obviously made in Byzantine style by Byzantine painters and Byzantine artists, and they were inscribed in Greek mostly, but many inscriptions are made also in Latin. And you can see here, Jesus Christos Rex Iudorum, so the Jesus Christ, King of Jews. And here there is an inscription in Latin, but the icon itself is, the title of the icon is in Greek, Iagia Anastasis, the Holy Resurrection. And here again, there are Latin inscriptions everywhere, because there's a Byzantine church in northern Italy where people spoke Latin in Middle Ages. Just one more example of this kind of art, also from southern Italy, from Sicily, coming from the 12th century, the famous Cathedral of Monreal. Here is the interior, and it's lavishly decorated with mosaics all over. And this triumphant image in the apse over the sanctuary, representing the already seen image of Jesus the Pantocrator. And it says here, Jesus Christos o Pantocrator in Greek. So Pantocrator means the upholder of all, the one who keeps everything in his palm, in his hand. It's usually translated into English as Jesus the Almighty or Christ the Almighty, because the idea is that he is all-powerful. He supports the whole world in its existence. And again, it's the open book, the blessing gesture, and the Christ cross-shaped halo. Just to give you an example of a mosaic with another motive, not all the mosaics were obviously like crucifixion and resurrection and baptism. Here we have the illustration of Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane, with the apostles sleeping and Jesus waking them up to be watchful, to spend time with him in prayer. And here Jesus praying and the angel coming to console him. And the inscription goes, Dominus Vigilates, so the vigilant Lord. So that we don't think that all the art from that time is mosaics, because it's not. Mosaics were the most extreme, expensive, elaborate, and lavish way to decorate the church, and many churches were not lucky to have so rich patrons, and many icons from that period come to us as frescoes. And here we will see a number of frescoes from the Balkans, from Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. And here is just an example of this kind of crypt church, fully decorated with mosaics inside. It's a very powerful presence, space conveying presence of the Lord and various saints. And the mosaics, the frescoes have their own expressive power that is very different from mosaics, but it's also powerful. It has its own aesthetic language and aesthetic appeal to people. Whereas mosaics, their strong side is that they have a lot of gold, and they are extremely well positioned on the spaces, interior spaces of the church. The frescoes are much more vivid, much more humane. They represent faces and emotions and vivid colors that speak to us in their own manner. Here we see a famous Crucifixion fresco from Studenica in Serbia. Excuse me. And John the Baptist face. In the art of this period, we see the emergence of emotions. If you see carefully the face of Jesus, and especially Mary and John here, they are clearly designed to convey sorrow, mourning, like John is even holding his palm to his cheek like that. And this is a development in this time, that art becomes more emotional and less detached from human emotions than it used to be before. And we will see this more and more in later icons. Another beautiful example of the fresco art from this period, from Nerezi in Macedonia. It's a deposition from the cross. And again, look at the faces of Mary and John. And we have many liturgical texts from this period that are built around the emotions of sorrow that Mary and the apostles and even angels experience at the sight of the dying Lord. So there are many texts in the Holy Week service that mention extreme sorrow, extreme excruciating pain on the part of Mary and other witnesses of Jesus' death. And the art of this period is also trying to convey this. Apart from that, it's also beautiful. You can see the way in which the body of Jesus is represented here, with extreme anatomic, maybe not precision, but attention to detail, and even kind of noble naturalism. The body of Jesus is beautiful. It's disproportionately stretched because it's taken from the cross where it was hanging. And the lines are beautiful. You can see the hand of Jesus, and it's the same line is the spine of the apostle here. So it goes like this. And the whole composition is extremely dynamic. It's very difficult for a painter to represent the movement of the body like this, that it's not frozen, it's not like bound together. It's very free, very, very dynamic, and at the same time, very harmonious and restrained in a good way. And also the colors, you can see it for yourself, both in this crucifixion even decorated with the stars. And here, as you can see, the favorite and the standard background for frescoes, for the wall painting of the church, is this deep blue on the all previous frescoes. Another one from the Resi, taken from the cross. Okay, standard wooden shield icons from that period. We know pretty many of them, but the famous Virgin, it's known in the West as Virgin of Vladimir, but it was originally donated. It was probably made in Byzantium in the best court iconography studio, probably commissioned by the emperor, and was sent as a gift to the Duke of Kiev shortly after the baptism of Ukraine in 988. Later it was taken to Moscow, and now it's in the Tretyakov Gallery. So it's one of the best Byzantine icons probably ever made and preserved. It's heavily damaged because usually what is reproduced is the central part, but the icon is much larger and has wide margins, which were undoubtedly painted. They probably had some scenes on additional scenes of the apostles or saints and angels on the margins, but the central part of the icon is stunningly beautiful, as you can see from the closer look at it. Although the faces, this damaged part of the icons were painted later by the restorers, but hopefully as close to the original as possible, so we can still enjoy the beauty of the original paintings. This icon is also a superb example that Byzantine art was not like anti-naturalistic. It was not always naive. You can see that this icon is the representation of human face is perhaps not naturalistic, but very deep, very profound. It's not like a childish drawing. It's not simple in a negative sense of this word. Yeah. The Church of the Holy Sophia in Kiev, it's another great monument of the Byzantine art of that period. As I said, architects of the church and the icon painters were Greek. They came from Constantinople, and the inscriptions on the icons in the church are also in Greek. So it's a completely kind of copy-paste replica of Byzantine architecture and church decoration. And the most famous image is this mosaic of the Mother of God, Oranda, which is placed on the apse over the sanctuary. Sometimes it's referred to as the immovable wall. Immovable wall, the wall that is so firmly protecting the city and its citizens. So the Mother of God praying to God is symbolically perceived as the fortress, as a stronghold that gives protection to those who come to her rescue, who come asking for their rescue to her. The other example is this mosaic of the Archangel. It's one of the dome representations of 4 archangels that accompany Jesus. And the Archangel is dressed as a deacon in Byzantine liturgy and as a imperial palace guard from the times of Roman Byzantine emperors. So it's kind of merger of military imagery and liturgical imagery. And he's holding this kind of, it's like a stick with a tablet. It's a liturgical object called Repidion that is being used in divine liturgy to kind of fly over the chalice. And it has the inscription Agios, 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 holy, holy, holy. So the central words of the Eucharistic liturgy, the hymn of the holy, holy, holy Lord of power and might. Just 2 more examples. There is a fresco of an angel in Hagia Sophia in Kiev, and the representation of Annunciation. It's made here of 2 images because they are on 2 pillars before the sanctuary. So the sanctuary is in the middle, and 2 architectural pillars that uphold the vault, they have this image of Gabriel on the one side and Mary on the other side. And again, all the inscriptions are in Greek, saying, rejoice, full of grace. And she's responding, here, behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it happen to me according to your word. Just number of examples of iconography from this period. Now it's from Kiev and Rus, but again, these are icons either brought from Constantinople or made by the artists locally, but the artists who originally came from Byzantium or by their immediate disciples. The famous Oranda icon, but in this case, unlike in Holy Sophia, she has the medallion with the image of Jesus on her chest, and the famous image of the Holy Face, the Achiropoietos, not made by human hands, the representation of Jesus on the cloth that he imprinted during his lifetime, and then it became a very popular iconographic motif in Byzantium that was focused strictly on the face of Jesus, and the face was represented surrounded by the nimbus, halo. Okay, and the final stage of the flowering of Byzantine art from the second half of 13th century to mid 15th century under the Paleologian emperors. Paleologos was the family name of the dynasty, and it has many important examples inside Byzantine Empire and outside in various local schools, like in Bulgaria, the Balkans, Kiev and Rus again, modern day Russia, Novgorod, Pskov, Moscow, and in the West, Cretan school in the Crete island, in the Mediterranean, and Proto-Renaissance Italy. The Proto-Renaissance art was heavily influenced by Byzantine art. We will look at a couple of examples, especially the Hora Church in Constantinople, and for that I will have to switch from my PowerPoint to another view in the browser that has a very good visualization of the Hora monastery. It will work better than with my presentation. Just give me a second. Okay. I'm not seeing it. I don't know why. It doesn't allow me to share this for some reason. I don't know why. Okay, here it is. Okay. Can you see now the Hora? Yeah, the picture. So it's a church in Constantinople that was an important monastery that was neglected and partially destroyed during the Crusade, and then rebuilt by one of the richest, basically like by the prime minister of Byzantine Empire, Theodore Metochites, and he invested a lot of money in making of beautiful mosaics for this church and frescoes. Here you can see on the first image extremely elaborate frescoes of the part of this church, but the real fame of this church comes from the mosaics. It's not so huge church, but it's fully decorated with mosaics inside. And when you are inside it, it's like you are in a kind of golden chest box covered with gold. You can see the mosaic here, the dome with Christ Pantocrator in the middle, and the figures of apostles and Old Testament figures on the perimeter. And then this famous mosaic of Christ, Jesus, I hora ton zonton. Hora in Greek means space or a country. So it's a word that has a number of meanings. One of the meanings is space, and the other meaning is country. And Hora ton zonton, the country of the living, is a quote from the Psalter again. That I will, there is a saying there, I will walk before the Lord in the country of the living. And this, so Jesus here is identified as the country of the living, the place of eternal life, the paradise. Here is a fresco from Hora, which you have already seen in my presentations before. Jesus' descent to hell, dragging out Adam and Eve by hands. So it was mostly just Adam's figure that received hands from Jesus, but in some frescoes, some presentations, it's two persons, Adam and Eve, simultaneously. Just a couple more examples of these mosaics. Apostle Peter. Again, the interior of the church. And here is an important one, Jesus on the throne and the founder, Metochites, bringing the replica of the church to the feet of Jesus. Something similar we have seen with this votive mosaics of the emperors. And Metochites is wearing a Turkish turban, as you can see. Something strange because it's before Turkish conquest, but it was the time already when Turks became very powerful and Byzantine elites were imitating their fashion in dress. So just kind of interesting twist of history. Here is the hora from the outside. As I said, it's not a huge structure. It's a kind of, by modern standards, it's a rather small church. Obviously, the minaret is a later addition, and the main structure is this. Just one more mosaic of Jesus with Mary, the Deesis kind of mosaic. Yeah, okay, so the same one with Metochitis in turban. Okay, let's return to our PowerPoint. Land of the living, that's true. The proper English rendering of this phrase is Jesus is the land of the living. Okay. So the hora, as I said, it has this wonderful dome mosaics with Jesus and apostles and Old Testament figures, and this, I think, the best ever representations of the anastasis. It's extremely dynamic, extremely vivid, and profound. Speaking of this kind of national schools of iconography that developed in the outskirts of Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire at that time, is, for example, the so-called Ohrid school. Ohrid is the name of the city that was the seat to the metropolitans that were Greek, but they were also like kind of missionary to the Slavs in the Balkans. Balkans were populated mostly by Slavic tribes, and they were source of trouble for the Byzantium, military speaking, but also they were one of the directions for evangelization on the part of the Byzantine Church, and one of the earliest converted Slavic tribes in the 8th century and onwards. And the iconography that developed in that territory, it's kind of Byzantine iconography. You cannot claim it to be Slavic iconography yet, but then it developed into local. So it's a normal model for all post-Byzantine world, that first generation iconographers were 100% Byzantine, and then they trained local guys to become their successors, and the local school of iconography gradually developed. Something like that happened with the Ohrid school of iconography. It was first Byzantine, it developed some local peculiarities, and then it is served as the starting point for the Macedonian and Bulgarian, later Bulgarian iconography. Just examples of those icons. The new thing, something we haven't seen before, is this metal coating put on the background of icons. In later developments in like 18th, 19th century, especially in Russia, this metal coating becomes so dominant that it covers the whole icon. Only faces are visible. I view it as a certain degradation of iconography, because, especially in this later version, because it kind of kills the painting. If you have this bronze or whatever, even golden coating, then it's completely metal, it's not painted, it covers all the painting, and in later times they even ceased to paint anything apart from faces because it was covered anyway, and there was no reason to make painting beneath the metal cover. But in this earlier period, it's a nice invention because it adds certain relief and 3D kind of feeling to the icon. And it's not invention of the Ohrid school. I think it's just a Byzantine thing that for some reason became more popular with the Ohrid school and is preserved mostly there. But then it becomes very popular in later Bulgarian iconography, and you can see the rounded halos. They have some volume inside, and so they're like rounded, and the metal coating on the icons all over. Again, the presentation of crucifixion, one has impression it has something to do with Romanesque art. This is a little bit more voluminous, more accent on the body than in standard Byzantine icons, but it's probably just a variation inside Byzantine art itself. It's not a foreign influence yet. We will see soon some foreign influences on Byzantine art, but not in the Ohrid school, but in the Cretan school. Just a couple more examples from the Ohrid school. Pay attention to this angel. He's like presented with clearly new inventions. Figure of Mary is rather conservative. There is nothing very distinct about the way her figure is represented, but angel has many more folds of the garment than in earlier Byzantine iconography, and especially it's visible with the wings. There are very many lines. It's very detailed, and also the background, the architectural details are much more meticulously made. They are not just a background for the icon, but they become an active part of the representation. The unnecessary details that were avoided in earlier Byzantine art are now coming as predecessors of something we will see in the Proto-Renaissance and Renaissance art. The Cretan school, it's generally considered as a post-Byzantine because it came to its flowering in the 15th century and onwards in 16th, 17th centuries, but certain tendencies start to emerge even earlier because Crete was on the crossroads of trade, and it always had very powerful Western contacts with Venetian and Genoesian merchants, and also with the Crusaders. And like this icon of the women meeting Jesus after the resurrection, if you see carefully, especially to this woman here, the way her hair is made looks very Western, very much under the influence of Renaissance paintings, the proto-Renaissance that is emerging at that time. We are already in the 15th century. So. The famous Mary of Perpetual Help is a typical Cretan icon that was taken from the island of Crete to Constantinople, and later probably by the Crusaders to Rome, and is now preserved in one of the churches in Rome and that are associated with the Redemptorist fathers. And due to that, it became popular worldwide. but the icon itself is Byzantine, and this is one of the representations of Mary that developed at that period. Mary with the child, with the heavy influence on the passion of Jesus. It's the so-called passionate Mother of God, because of the angels that are carrying the symbols of the passion, the spear and the sponge and the cross. Just another example of a later Cretan icon that has very heavy Western influences that you can see especially on the headdress of Mary here. And the scenes like this deposition into the tomb that are very Western, very much influenced by Western Proto-Renaissance, Renaissance art. Completely different style of iconography develops in Constantinople itself in the mid-13th century and all the way to the end of Byzantium in the mid-15th century. And this is a very austere, very ascetic, very inward-oriented art that is inspired by the so-called hesychasm. I don't know if you ever heard of this spiritual movement in Byzantium. It was a monastic spirituality oriented towards internal prayer of the heart, the so-called Jesus prayer that focuses on the inner purity and inner ability of human beings to contemplate the divine light, the light of God that enlightens us spiritually from inside. So this type of art is very contemplative. It's kind of minimalistic visually. It gets rid of everything that is unessential and leaves only the person of Jesus or Mary with the child Jesus. It usually plays with light. It's built on the contrast of quite dark colors and very light, very strong, thin lines of light that, like you can see on the face of Jesus here, the so-called assist, the net of golden strokes of light that can be on the body parts or on garments of the figures represented. Icon like this is fully designed to facilitate one's focused contemplative prayer. Just a couple more examples of the same type of iconography. As you can see, there is nothing superfluous in those images. It's only human representations and sometimes inscriptions. There is no decoration, no additional details. Everything has to serve the ideal of simple and focused prayer and concentration. Sometimes the colors of this iconography get very vivid. They don't need necessarily to be just dark and golden like in those icons. They can be very life-affirming, like in this beautiful representation of Transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain by Theophan the Greek, the Byzantine artist who worked in the modern day Russia. He was a Greek, but immigrated to Russia, so to speak. And he left a number of extremely good icons. And this, again, this representation of Transfiguration, it's very vivid in its colors, but it still follows the line of this Hesychast spirituality, for which the Transfiguration was extremely important. Transfiguration as the enlightenment of the world and human beings by the light of Christ. And exactly this is how the Christ is represented in this icon. He is surrounded by two figures of Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Tabor, and three apostles who fell down scared by this new appearance of Jesus. And Jesus is transfigured. He's white as snow, and he's shining with this almost like lightnings of light. The rays of light are so acute, they are represented as cutting knives. And these rays come to apostles, like hit them or pierce them. The icon is conveying this extremely dramatic experience of inner transformation by the light of Christ that shines in the hearts of the people who practice this spirituality. Again, icon of Mary with Jesus in this minimalistic Byzantine iconography. Just some faces of the icons by Theophan. And famous Andrei Rublev with the Trinity. And an icon of Christ the Pantocrator, from which only a fragment survived. It was a much larger icon, but what we have today is only this piece of it, with representing the face and shoulders. Very powerful representation of the face of Jesus. Few more icons, probably written by Rublev too. As you can see from the colors, they are somewhat similar to what we have just seen with Theophan the Greek. So Rublev was either imitating or learning from Theophan. Or just representing a common tradition. Another famous painter that worked in northern Russia, Dionysi, he left many wall paintings, frescoes, but also some best examples of iconography of that period, 15th century. Oops. Okay. I finished my presentation, and perhaps you have some questions. We are, what about time? Okay, yeah, we are pretty much out of time. And let me just unmute you. Maybe you have something to ask. Hmm. There is a question here. I wonder if you can talk about the hand placement on icons of the Theotokos. You probably mean the gesture with which Mary is pointing towards Jesus. So she's holding Jesus like this. Let me just share the screen. I have one example here. That's what you mean, right? Yeah, so we are going to speak about that in more detail, but it's a Marian icon called Hodigitria, the one that shows the way. Hodigitria from Greek means the one that shows the way. And Mary is holding Jesus and pointing her hand towards him because he is the way and the life and truth from the gospel, right? So she's pointing to the one who is the center of our salvation. Okay, any other questions? Were the frescoes icons painted in egg tempera? Yes. Probably there were also other techniques. I'm not sure, but certainly there was egg there are many egg tempera frescoes, and they are the very name fresco comes from I think Italian word fresh. That means that the paints were applied to the fresh mortar while before it gets dry. So once you do that, the image becomes solidly integrated into the wall structure. You cannot wash it away after that. So it's a peculiarity of the fresco technique. Just allow me a second. I'm trying to unmute you. I don't know what's going on. I cannot do that for some reason. Oh.
Actually, the computer sends us a message, and then you have to hit the button that says unmute if you want to get unmuted. That's what you have to do.
Yeah, but I had a way to unmute everyone. So to let you unmute yourself, that was, but you seem to, yeah, please go ahead. You have a question, right?
They might not be able to unmute themselves. My computer sent me a message saying that you could unmute me, and I hit unmute, and it unmuted myself.
Okay, but you have a question, do you?
Mine was about the egg temperature.
That
was for me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, and someone typed here, there seem to be few common people. Tom, what do you mean by that? Okay, I have an icon of black Madonna with 3 hands, and wonder if any other icons represent people of color. Well, it's a very good question. I don't know if Monica is here, one of the participants of our course, Monica, she's preparing a book on rosary illustrated with icons, and she was asking me the same question. Yeah, hi Monica, I see you. If there are people of color. Yeah, there are Ethiopian icons that were painted by the Ethiopian Christians in Africa, and they are black. If I have time, I will show you more next time, more of that. I was planning to show you some Georgian, Armenian, Syrian, and Ethiopian icons, at least very briefly. But regarding the Madonna you have, don't be misled by the color. It's not black Madonna in the racial sense. It's simply that Greek painters, Mediterranean painters, they were using pigments that for the faces that look very dark to us, but they didn't have the idea to represent people of color. That was simply an artistic technique to represent people of standard skin color to them. So Greeks, Asia Minor citizens, citizens of Palestine, that have more or less darker color than, say, Northern Europeans, but they are not black, meaning like African origin or South Asian. So all the racial questions, they were rather alien for the Byzantine mind. They didn't consider it to be of any importance or value to be rendered in iconography. So if your Madonna is black, it's probably because just because of the pigments that are used, and also they get darker with time. Another question. I had those questions about the differences between the power of icons as compared with sacramentals. Yes, thank you, Marilyn, for reminding this. Marilyn wrote to me a letter with a very good question. She was a little bit puzzled, should I say, with my comments that icons are like direct channels of the presence of God. I said something that icon connects us with the prototype, and if you kiss the icon of Christ, this is as if you were kissing Jesus himself. And she said that maybe this realistic approach is like overstated. Maybe I shouldn't say that, because it sounds like there is no difference between the real presence of the Eucharist and the presence of Jesus in the icons. And of course, I didn't mean to push this as far. In Byzantine theology of the icon, there is a clear line of distinction between Eucharist as the real presence, the real presence, so to speak, and icons as something we could call virtual presence. I don't want to baffle you with this, philosophical distinctions, but just I want to make clear that for Byzantine theology of the image, icon is not an idol. It's not something that this board and this paints becomes divine. No, by no means. It's just a representation of divinity, but since this representation is inscribed with the name of Christ, and it is the person of Christ that is represented, Byzantine theology of the image has certain degree of realism, claiming that our contact with God through the icons is real, not imaginary. It's not simply psychological. It's not like we are just recalling Jesus because we are looking at his picture, but there is something deeper and more serious going on. We are actually touching Jesus through the mediation of the Holy Spirit, somewhat similar as we hear the voice of Jesus in the gospel when the gospel is read in the church. And it's not like physical voice of Jesus. Of course, it's a voice of a priest or a deacon that reads the gospel, but the word of God is essentially Jesus' word, and we are touching and we are touched by that word. So something similar is going on with the icons. That's as much as I can say about that. Another question, very interesting, but we have to leave. Will we be notified of the final class? Okay, guys, I have sent you a number of emails notifying you about the precise dates and precise times of classes. There was no change whatsoever in our original schedule. So please just stick to that. I am not going to answer 20 emails every time asking when is their next meeting. Our schedule is on the course web page, which you all received. And please refer to this web page. If there would be a change, I notify you, but there is no change from that original schedule. It's always 3 p.m. your time, and it's the next Saturday with the same Zoom link. If anything happens, I send you update, like urgent change or anything, but so far it never happened and will hopefully not happen now. So please just stick to the schedule.
I think he's probably referring to when you said there'll be an extra class on the end. Okay. That's probably what he's referring to.
Okay, sorry then if I misunderstood that. If there will be another class next week, we will have to see. But I will announce it on Saturday, and it will also depend on your response. If you are interested in having another class, if we will certainly be short of time to cover the planned material. So I will need another class, and I'm willing to do that for you if you are interested. And then we will come to terms on Saturday regarding the precise time for that, whether Monday or Wednesday or Tuesday or Wednesday of the next week. But we still have Saturday to discuss that. I think final questions. When were written rules developed governing the placement of subjects within the churches, such as subjects for the altar area, domes, and so on? So the rules that regulate what has to be inside the churches and so on were developed very gradually over many, many centuries, reaching back at least to the 4th century and still developing in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And I think they will be developing even further. But in the main layout of the church was pretty much fixed by the 9th century. And there were some developments in the Byzantine Rite in the 12th, 14th centuries. And after that, the Byzantine church interior and different parts of it are more or less unchanged. What you cannot say about the Western Rite. For example, after the Vatican II, many changes were implemented. Yeah, there are some modern icons. Monica is reminding me, there are some modern icons by Arab or African iconographers, or even like Native American artists, maybe not necessarily iconographers, not working in the Byzantine tradition, that pay some attention to race and ethnicity. Like distinctly Arabic, distinctly Ethiopian, distinctly Armenian icons. That's true, but these are the phenomena of the 20th, 21st century, not the ancient traditional ones. Good. Okay, sorry it's so long. I think you are a little bit tired and bored, but we just have a lot of material, and I hope we cover it and you learn from it. So if you are to rewatch this on YouTube later, you just can always pause and replay it later and so on. So the YouTube recording, I think gives you a lot of flexibility on that. But thank you very much for your patience and your zeal. You're really inspiring me, and see you again on Thursday. On Saturday. Sorry, I'm just... there is a question from Tom. Sorry, could could not unmute to explain my question. I guess I was thinking about whether some icons conveyed a relationship between God and believers. Can you please raise this question next time? I think it's worth exploring, and I would comment on it a little more. But please remind me, Tom, remind me of that next time.